Hi, my name is Dan Ziegler. I'm with Luxus Walnut. We sell Turkish walnut based here in Verona, Kentucky, United States. First thing I was going to talk about today was a little bit of the history of the wood and how it's cut and where it comes from. One of the first questions that I'm asked most often is this wood quarter sawn. And that brings up a good point because most of the wood you see in the stores is slab sawn. The difference between quarter sawn and slab sawn is basically a tree is brought through a sawmill and just laid out, and they just keep cutting, keep cutting, keep cutting until it's all gone. Whereas quarter sawn, they're going to cut it in half, and then cut the half in half and start flipping that quarter over and over until it's gone. The difference and the reason for the quarter sawn being desirable is the stability of the wood. Wood that is quarter sawn tends to gain and lose moisture on all sides the same rate so that it stays in the same position. You notice this most in the wood you get from Home Depot or Lowe's. When you go to build after it's dried a little more, it starts to turn and twist. That doesn't happen with the quarter sawn. When we talk about wood, we also talk about wood for rifles anyway. We talk about wood grading. So we have grading ranges 1 to 5, 1 to 10, utility to exhibition. Depends on who you're talking to and how they sell the wood. I typically use a word presentation. So utility, standard grade, semi-fancy, moderately fancy, medium fancy, extra fancy, and then exhibition. And it makes a difference only to those who are really interested in getting the top piece of wood. When you talk about the exhibition, it has to not only be beautiful on both sides, but both sides have to match. So you're looking for at least 75% figure behind the wrist on both sides, extraordinary figure in the buttstock, and that typically will come in as premium or royal or class 5. Some use 1 to 7 grading. That might be grade 7. So we sell everything from the utility all the way up to the exhibition grade. One way you can tell an exhibition grade when you see a picture, especially when they show both sides, if both sides match not just in beauty, but in the way the lines run, the way the figure runs through the buttstock, and that's important. It's very difficult to find. That makes it more valuable. One of the next things I hear asked a lot is, well, what kind of wood is this? What is Turkish walnut? Well, Turkish walnut is Circassian walnut or royal walnut. Juglans regia is the Latin term for the species. And it originated, they believe, in northern Iran. And the reason it became very valuable is because it was one of the first to be marketed on the old Silk Road trade routes between Europe and Asia. The walnuts themselves were desirable, and then the trees were naturally transplanted along that route. They found a good home in Turkey where a mineral in the soil, the minerals in the soil helped create a lot of the dark striping that you see, and the mineral streaks are what become very desirable in the figure. You can have the same trees grown in Pakistan, the other end of the trade route, and that has much less figure. It's much more plain. Same genetic species, but nowhere near as beautiful. Another thing that we're looking for when we're buying wood for gun stocks is the amount of movement in the grain, and that's typically not found in the trunk of the tree. We're looking for areas of the tree like the root ball, the trunk to root transition, and then the crotches in a tree. Those provide the most beautiful figure. So when you see a lot of trees out in California grown for nuts, a lot of them are pretty much straight, and they don't have the kind of figure that we can find most often in the Turkish walnut. Many of the trees that are grown in Turkey were grown on individual farms. They were the nuts for the people who lived there, and they've been there for hundreds of years. And as they begin to die, that's when the farmers recognize they can sell the wood. Even though the tree has stopped producing nuts, they can sell the trunk and the root ball for good money. And that's where most of the best stuff comes from. In those trunk to root ball transitions, you'll see a lot of movement of the grain in the directions that you're going to want to see in a gun. from the straight along the barrel channel down to movement in the buttstock. Often you'll see some quilting or fiddleback as well, and that is a way that the tree is growing under stress. It's kind of like a six-pack on a guy who's a bodybuilder. Not me. One of the things that we'll often see in Turkish walnut is a transition between the heartwood and the sapwood. The sapwood in a Turkish walnut tree tends to be very strong as well, and so it can often be used and incorporated in some beautiful rifles. Normally you wouldn't want it because it tends to be soft, but we can find it very often in the transition pieces that they're still showing fiddleback and they are indicating a very strong piece of wood. So that kind of gives a history of Turkish walnut, the origins, where it came from, the kind of grading that we do, and when people ask for different grades, we can help them find those depending on what they're after. Burl is something that people ask for a lot. And what is burl? Burl is a section of wood that is effectively scar tissue. It is a place in the tree where there was injury, a disease, something happened to damage the tree. And now this is the tree's attempt at growing over that damage and protecting itself. Most often when that happens, you see a large ball on the side of a tree. It can be on the trunk, it can be on the branches, it can be in the root section if somebody has hit the roots a long time ago or if there was disease in the roots. And depending on where it's at, you can get different appearances of burl. Some of the burl in the root balls goes in every different direction because the roots were going in every different direction. An ideal section of burl for a rifle would be along the side of the trunk of the tree, so that you cut it high enough above the burl to get the straight grain that you want coming down the barrel channel, and then you get into the burl ball itself in the buttstock. So you have the beauty of the burl in the butt, and then you have the beautiful straight quarter sawn rifle channel, the barrel channel. Most often, though, what we'll see in a typical burl is around the root section, and most of those are very difficult to get perfectly quarter sawn because they're in that transition from straight trunk to moving out around the roots. Those are the ones that become difficult to work with from a shotgun builder's perspective or a rifle builder's perspective because they don't have the grain that you would normally think of as strong grain. We've seen some builders use chassis inside the burls to make the beautiful wood strong because the wood is actually just a cover-up for the aluminum chassis that's underneath. That's one way to effectively have the beauty of burl and the strength of straight grain. Others will look for the perfect transition that we spoke about, where you're going to be looking at the grain straightening out through the wrist up into the receiver area and having the beauty of the burl in the butt. Most often when we see the grain, we're seeing a very plain, straight movement of the wood as it grows. Often we'll find fiddleback or curling or quilting. That is a way that the wood is growing, and it's sort of the rippling effect that you can see when you first cut into it, and especially after it's finished. That indicates that the wood was growing under strain, that there was a lot of back and forth push on the tree, for instance, that caused it to build that strong wood grain that becomes so beautiful when you finish it. So a shotgun builder is going to be more concerned about the strength in the receiver and the grip area. So as the impact from the shell pushes back on the receiver, that receiver is pushing back on the wood stock, so you need to have a very strong section at the head of the stock. The rifle builder is going to be looking for the same thing, but now they want a piece that's much longer. Their piece is going to have that straight grain all the way out to the tip of the barrel. So what they want, if it's going to be equally beautiful in the grip back, what they want is going to be more rare to come across. So shotgun builders can often get a better looking piece of wood at a lower price because you can put a separate piece for the forearm together with a separate piece for the buttstock and get two beautiful pieces that will work for the purpose intended. Storing wood is very important. The way they dry it, they put chinking or stickers, some of them are calling it, basically small pieces of wood between the individual cut pieces of the gun blanks. Those allow air movement in and out of the stack of wood. That happens over the course of about 3 to 4 years. Typically, for a piece that's going to be about 3 inches, it needs at least 1 year of drying, air drying per inch of thickness. So once it's dried and then it's shipped, what we will typically do here is receive it, check the moisture content. If it's below 12%, it's ready to be sanded. If it's above 12%, it's going to have to sit for a while. If it's, say, 10 or 11%, we'll go ahead and sand it and let it sit until it's at least, or at most, 10%. And then we'll apply the linseed oil or the tung oil, teak oil, actually is my favorite, and then put a coat of lacquer on it. That'll effectively help us see what it looks like as a finished stock, as well as then protect it from moisture gain or loss. Different areas of the country have different humidity levels. Here in the Midwest, we would have things swinging between 9% and 13%. So in my shop, I have a mini split air conditioning unit that doesn't really keep it cool, but it helps pull the moisture out to keep things stable. That's important as I'm drying, because I don't want a piece of wood getting more moisture from the air here in the Midwest and then drying over the winter and losing it again. So we keep everything at a reasonable dew point here inside the shop. Once it's sealed, we don't have as much of a concern. I've had customers say, well, I'm not going to do anything with this for 2 years. Are there any special storage instructions? Once we've sealed it with the wax ends and the lacquer coating, you can just store that indoors. There won't be an issue. So kiln drying is a process where they're going to heat up the wood in a controlled environment, usually right at the 210 to 212 point, driving off the moisture. It's wonderful for production lumber because they have a lot of wood they need to get it dry fast. It's not good for shotgun stocks, rifle stocks, because it cures quickly, and when you let it back out into the moist environment, just standard moisture in the Midwest, it's going to rapidly regain some of that moisture, and when it does so, it can then move. A lot of the gun makers, and I really appreciate the Custom Gunmakers Guild, ACGG members will share their expertise freely. They say they want to see a stick of wood sitting for 6 years because there's internal stresses that need to be released over time as this piece of wood dries in the air. You don't get that opportunity when you kiln dry. You force it dry, it's now dry, and then you let it go. Over time, it can then begin to gain moisture and twist. A la Lowe's and Home Depot construction lumber. So I often get the question, well, how in the world did you get into this line of business? And I guess I would have to say it's always been an interest of mine. My grandfather was a sawmiller, and he had a sawmill that was a fire tube steam boiler, clay fire tube steam boiler, all the way back to the 1920s. And so growing up, I've always had sawdust in my lungs, if you will. The smell of it was always very pleasant to me. So when I retired after 30 years as an engineer with Duke Energy, I was looking for something to do, and Luxus Arms is the prior owner of Luxus Walnut. They wanted to go into more of the black gun market with what they have now as the HM defense line. So I had the opportunity to buy Luxus Walnut to focus on just the wood. So that's what I did. And it hasn't been my main source of income since, but it's something that I enjoy doing and get to meet a lot of fun people and go to neat shows. We talked a little bit about grading and how you can tell if a piece is truly exhibition grade or presentation grade or not. It's important to have a lot of figure throughout the piece, good strong grain in the important areas where it makes the most difference, but a lot of beautiful grain in the buttstock and everywhere else. Not only that, but it has to match both sides. So here's an example where both sides are going to be essentially identical. Both sides having equivalent amount of grain movement, both sides having the same appearance, and both sides would qualify as exhibition grade. So this piece would be extra fancy. It's not going to meet the presentation or exhibition grade because even though it's beautiful, has a lot of movement, the sides don't perfectly match. So you can pretty much be assured when you do the finished profile on this, both sides going to be beautiful, but it's not going to look the same on both sides. One other question we get is what is fiddleback, what is quilting, what is marble cake? This piece that we were talking about being exhibition has a couple of those qualities. In the front section, you can see this undulating appearance that would be fiddleback. Fiddleback is going to be a more consistent, evenly spaced appearance like this. Whereas it also has back here quilting, or that undulation, not only in one direction, one axis, but it's also moving in the piece of wood. So here you've got fiddleback and quilting. When people talk about marble cake, what is marble cake? So marble cake, if you think about where the name comes from, it is from the chocolate marble cake. So you've got this vanilla cake or yellow cake that has chocolate swirls in it. And the swirls are not consistent, they're not in the same direction, they move around. So here's an example where you've got this background that's lighter, and then you've got these movement of these black lines swirling around. Both sides on this piece have a certain amount of that marble cake. So one of the other type of figure that people are interested in seeing on a gun stock is feather crotch. And it gets its name because it is a piece of wood from the crotch of a tree that has this appearance of feather coming through it. Now, if I could have this piece look exactly the same this side as the other, it would be exhibition. As it stands now, it's just going to be a fancy grade because this side might be exhibition, but this side is far from it. This side is going to be semi-fancy. So when you put the two together, the end result is going to be a shotgun that's going to look very, very nice. It's going to have beautiful appearance on both sides, but they're drastically different. Feather crotch on one side, marble cake on the other. Here we've got a nice slab of wood that we would use for a pair of sister rifle builds. Same concept as with the shotguns, only if you wanted two rifles to be built out of the same piece of wood or the same tree, we help people find that. This makes for a very unusual and very unique opportunity for a build. So people talk about, why can't I build with a piece of burl wood? You can, but it's a lot different depending on how the wood was cut out of the tree. Here's an example of some burl wood that would be beautiful when it's finished. But as you can see, the grain is growing in what I would call a very confused manner. It's going all different directions. If you were to try to build a shotgun out of this, you're not going to have any kind of strength in the area that's most important for carrying the shock of a shotgun firing. This would be a piece of wood that would only be suitable for someone who's building with a chassis type construction. So they carve out essentially a hole in the center of this, and they would put a metal tube chassis inside of this to carry the shock loading from the receiver all the way back through to the butt plate. And they typically would also have a shock absorber system in it. ProSoft out in Colorado does that. Here's an example of one that would actually be useful for a shotgun without any additional fabrication. And the reason for that, as you can see, the grain is growing in the direction of receiving the shock load and transmitting that shock load back into the buttstock. So you can have a beautiful buttstock and a strong receiver end. So that's the difference between these two, both of them burl. This is likely a burl, the section here is burl, that was growing along the tree trunk to tree root section. So any of the burls are suspect for voids. Here's an example of a burl that was being carved actually by ProSoft out in Colorado that had some of these pit holes, these are expected. And if you were to look at these smaller ones, you might fill those either with a wood filler, wood putty. You might fill them with epoxy. But when you get something that's this large, that's something that would be, in the range of gun that you're building here, unacceptable. You wouldn't want a big piece of epoxy, black epoxy, like that on your $50,000 shotgun. So in this case, we took this piece back and provided an alternative. But with burl, you have to expect some small voids. You can see most of them. We try to avoid selling any if we see them, or if we do, we make sure people know about them. So one of the other things that can happen with burl is you can end up with soft spots, or let's just say a whole bunch of voids that you don't like. So in the case of this one that we said build a chassis for, one of the other options is called stabilizing. And what that amounts to is you put this piece of wood in a tank, you pull a vacuum on it, and then you introduce a resin into the tank. And then all of these voids get filled with the resin. And it would either be clear, you could get black, you could get brown, you could even dye this to be some of the craziest looking wood you've ever seen. And then after it's completely impregnated with this resin, you take it out and you place it into a heating chamber. And that heating chamber then raises the temperature until it essentially bakes solid. The benefit to that is now you've got a chunk of wood that is plastic impregnated, for the lack of a better word, and it now is stronger than wood. It's going to be more impervious to moisture. The downside to it is you typically add weight. In many cases, it can almost double the weight. So if you've got a shotgun you were already thinking about putting mercury weights in to help with the recoil, good idea. You don't need the mercury now. You've got a heavy stock to begin with. If you're looking for a featherweight or one for a small stature person, not a good idea. We talked a little bit about Turkish walnut and the fact that it's actually Circassian or royal walnut. The fact is, European walnut, whether it's Tessier French walnut without being on the Tessier plantation, or English walnut, it's all royal walnut, which originated, we believe, in northern Iran. And I talked a little bit about how Pakistani or Circassian walnut grown in Pakistan has less figure and less interesting characteristics from a gun builder's perspective. Here's a piece from Pakistan, and compared to some of these other pieces from Turkey, it's dramatically different. It's just very plain. This is very good utility grade. This is an excellent piece for military restoration or just a good strong utility rifle, but you don't see much in the way of mineral streaking. And you certainly don't see anything like the marble cake that you find in the Turkish walnut. In total contrast, here you've got a piece of black walnut, American black walnut, and how much darker that tends to be than either the Pakistani or the Turkish royal walnut. One other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was the difference between wood that comes out of the trunk of the tree and wood that comes out of a burl. And I think these are some pretty good examples. You can see here, this is a beautiful piece of wood. It's very, very straight grained, and it's got a lot of dark mineral lines, mineral streaks that will help make this a very beautiful gun that's going to pop, so to speak, when you look at it. And here you've got a couple of burls. These came out of the same set of burls, the same set of blanks that were purchased. And what you can do with these is to make sister sets. Even though it's not out of the same piece of wood, these were literally sliced out of the same burl in the same tree in a series. So one of the things that I like to do that many other suppliers don't necessarily do is to actually use some of the wood that I sell. I never let any of the scraps go without looking at them and thinking, how can I make something out of them? Everything from wine stoppers, just pen holders, pistol grips, business card holders, even just messing around just to see how pieces of wood turn. This was a piece of burl, and I was a little worried how strong it might be if you turned it into a cylinder, and it turned out just fine. Gear shift knobs, thought it would be fun to make some of those. Even got into making knives. One of the most important things that I've learned, though, in the industry is the camaraderie and the help that all of the Custom Gunmakers Guild members provide each other. I helped Dan Rosser a couple times finding the right piece of wood, and he helped me with this rifle with my uncle's little 22, and I wanted to see what it would be like to finish some of the wood myself. So he offered to rough cut, duplicate this stock in this piece of wood, and then I did the final sanding and fitting and finishing. Another thing I've been doing with the wood is helping Michael Ullman Precision Products. He does the checkering tools, and he needed something that he could provide with his checkering tool sets for customers to practice on, and the end result being something they could use. So I provided him the pieces of wood, and he's now providing customers with pieces that they can test checker, and they end up with a coaster. So we like to help guild members. We like to use the wood ourselves. I think this is a pretty good example of just how far afield we can get with the Turkish walnut.